It was the summer of 1982. A steady breeze blew from the southwest as I stood on the shore of the west arm of Grand Traverse Bay, readying my laser sailboat for launching. A boyhood friend had surprised me with our first visit in several years and funneled questions my way. I filled him in on all the good things in my life: money, a vibrant lifestyle, and a beautiful wife, pregnant with our first child. "What's going on in your spiritual life?" he asked. I paused, curled my toes into the warm sand, and said, "Well, I'm a good guy, and God loves me for it. You know, the good guy theory." My friend listened intently and then simply stated, "Scripture has a little more to say than that." Dragging the laser over the dry, squeaky sand, I noted emptiness in the pit of my stomach and pushed the boat into open water and pointed up towards Power Island. Summer turned to fall, and I continued my 120-mile commute between Traverse City and the family farm project I was overseeing in Midland. Fall was a time when all of nature appeared unsettled. I too was restless, and the blackish-green crows along the roadside that took flight when my car approached reminded me of this. I simply told myself I would relax once we finished construction and the baby was born. Then the call came. "I don't think they are real contractions. Must be what they call Braxton Hicks. Maybe you should come home." I heeded my wife's concern, traveled back to Traverse City, and we both went to bed that evening convinced all was fine. We were wrong. The ride to the hospital that night seemed like a rehearsed fire drill for an event that was never meant to happen. Upon admittance to the hospital and examination, we were informed that birth was imminent, and after several hours of observation were wheeled into a stainless delivery room, closing the door behind us to normalcy and exposing us to a hazy, dreamlike situation. A half-dozen gowned and masked figures stood gathered around us, looking mystical, with hands extended and held apart, like a sacrifice was about to take place. Today I can admit that I was scared. Back then I couldn't, or maybe wouldn't. Don't really know if it matters. And I'm not sure if scared is the right word. Looking back, I think I was traumatized. My insides buzzing and anxious, like a swarm of bees that had lost their queen and now awaited rescue. I was waiting for someone to rescue us, to rescue me. "We'll get through this. We'll all be okay," I assured my wife while wrestling with my own doubt. We hadn't even been through the preparatory work of a Lamaze class. This wasn't the time to have a baby. Nature thought otherwise, and after a full labor, our baby was squirted into the waiting hands of the on-call physician. "You have a boy," someone announced over hushed and urgent voices. And then we heard a mouse squeak of a cry. "He's alive!" I didn't dare believe it. This imperfect moment needed to be wiped away like grease from clean glass. And my wife was crying and asking me if he had all his fingers and toes. The bees stirred inside of me, accompanied by the thought, "You can always try again if he doesn't make it." That was the only time that thought occurred to me, and I spent the next 19 days of Patrick's life hoping and praying that my 2-pound son the size of my father's hand would live. He did not. The year that Patrick would have turned 21, I began to realize that it was his mom who had completed her grief process and moved on, while I hadn't fully grieved. I began to review his brief life through the few photos and the life-altering memories. The primary reason Patrick's death was removed from me was that he had been flown to a university hospital for surgery on day 17 of his short life. That was the only day that I had convinced his mother to leave his side and attend a post-Thanksgiving meal on the family farm. Upon our return, a somber crew from neonatal informed us of Patrick's abrupt medical change and described the intestinal infection he was battling. We were advised to say our goodbyes and then return home to wait on a call to authorize surgery before driving the 4.5 hours to join him. God, those bees swarmed again, this time in my head, where I had taken my feelings of sadness and fear. Linda wept. I did not. For long ago I had learned the rule well: big boys don't cry. We did as we were told and went home, began asking difficult questions. Should we take to the road and stop every 15 minutes to find a pay phone to call the university to authorize surgery? Or should we stay home and wait for the phone before embarking? And then there was a question of what to do about the breast pump and the milk flow. All these questions would be answered, some by default and some by personal election, kind of like the sins of commission and omission. Did he have sins? As a self-directed man who'd been raised with a mixed Christian theology, I believed him innocent. But Patrick's mother, who was reared in a home where God was acknowledged on holidays, wanted him baptized. So a Christian nurse performed the ritual as we huddled at home, his mother's tears and milk flowing continuously while I held her and Patrick held to life with his fragile grasp. I used to think that Patrick persevered out of the will to live. Today I understand differently. That son of ours hung on, clung to life, like he was waiting for something or someone. He was waiting for us to say goodbye and for me to be released from those bees that held me captive. On November 29, 1982, Patrick Richard Raetz died in the arms of the nurse who had baptized him. Numbed and exhausted, we elected to donate his body to research with the hope that some information would be added to the field of knowledge concerning premature birth. Fully aware that we had seen Patrick for the last time just prior to his being flown to the university hospital, we began to prepare a small memorial service to include family, friends, and neonatal staff. My sister Judy presented us with a little white Bible that was on the altar in place of a casket in which the following was inscribed: "In loving memory of little Patrick Richard, who will live in our hearts and our minds forever, love Aunt Jude and Uncle Bill." Goodbyes were spoken, and my father offered up a prayer that, unbeknownst to us, in 9 short months would be inscribed on his own tombstone. After Patrick's death, I decided I was going to return to church. My wife eventually consented and carried Patrick's little white Bible like a child clinging to a stuffed animal. They say opposites attract. I found this to be true, as my wife was as organized as I was disorganized, but somehow that Bible was lost within a matter of a few weeks from the time of Patrick's death. We turned our house upside down. We traced our steps and put family and friends on alert in the hope that the Bible would be found without avail. Years passed, and we pressed on, pretty much forgetting about the Bible and remembering Patrick's birth and death quietly, each in our own way, especially after we divorced. I grew up on a dairy farm in Bay County, Michigan, as one of 6 children whom Mom and Dad sent to a private Christian school, of which I was one of the only 2 boys in our class of 5. Steve was the other. Steve and I weren't especially close, and one of my memories was that of following the teacher's directive to purchase your secret Santa, a gift that you would want for yourself. I agonized over giving Steve the gift that I coveted, a pair of cowboy gloves that said on them, "Have guns, will travel," along with a pair of handcuffs. I watched Steve tear off the wrapping paper, and then he turned to me and said, "This is really a stupid gift." I couldn't believe it. But you know what? The gift he gave me left no lasting memory either. The last childhood contact I had with Steve was the 5th grade, when he entered the public school system in a different county. We did not see each other again until our early 30s, when I bumped into him in the community I called home as an adult, Traverse City, Michigan, and learned that Steve and his family had taken over a printing operation in northern Michigan. We had dinner, made plans to get together again, but never followed through. A couple more years passed before I once again saw Steve and invited him to a new church I was participating in. He had as little interest in attending church as he did in those gloves and cuffs I'd given him back in elementary school. Except this time he said politely, "No, thank you." A couple of more years passed, and Steve called me with a question. Did I still worship at the church I'd invited him to, and could he join me? He went on to explain that he had been doing some soul-searching and realized he had questions in need of answers. Unfinished business with God, if you will. So Steve began attending church with his family, and the 2 of us became acquainted and developed a bond that never existed in our early years. 2 boys, now men, living 120 miles from their hometown in the pint-sized elementary school they attended half a lifetime ago. It was the Easter season of 2001 when Steve's parents traveled north to Traverse City and visited on the same Sunday as my own mother. After the worship service was completed, they began to visit over their memories of rearing children in the same school. As they exchanged pleasantries, my mother responded to their questions. Yes, she still lived in the Midland area, and yes, she still played organ at the same church. Steve's dad listened closely before interjecting. "Gosh, must have been 15 or 20 years ago I was on a street near the church where you worship when I spotted something on the side of the road. I stopped to investigate, and I found a little white Bible. Picked it up and hung on to it all these years. with plans to look up someone from your church someday to see if they knew anything about it. I even packed it back and forth to Arizona the past several years, used it to teach a class." "You've got to be kidding me," Mom exclaimed out of habit while intuiting her conclusion. "There's something written in it, isn't there, Paul?" said Steve's mom. She turned back to Mom. "When are you going home, Dot? We'll dig out the Bible and call you." Phone numbers were exchanged as my mother explained that she'd be staying with me that evening and returning home to Midland the next day. My daughter Brittany is a unique soul. When adopted through an open adoption program, her mother and I had determined that we would not take on a special needs child as we were still recovering from significant loss. Brittany checked out of the hospital with a clean bill of health, but then began to confound us with her developmental delays. Her eventual diagnosis was a severe hearing loss and personality features specific to the autism spectrum disorder and a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, attention deficit, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Both her mother and I and the professionals who worked with her began to recognize an additional personality feature. Angels without wings, characterized by love for everyone no matter what they've done or where they've been, incapable of amassing regret or harboring resentments. True to her autistic personality's demand for sameness and routine, Brittany decided to watch the television show Touched by an Angel every Sunday evening from 8 until 9 p.m. So when the call came that Sunday evening, we were predictably engrossed in Touched. It was Steve's dad who spoke first. "Rob, this is Paul Dornbos. I've got this Bible in my hand, and it says, 'In loving memory of little Patrick Richard, who will live in our hearts and our minds forever, love Aunt Jude and Uncle Bill.'" There was silence. I closed my eyes and could still see my sister's handwriting looping across the page in blue ink. "Wow, I can't believe it. That's the Bible," I said softly. "My son's Bible. Thank you. Thank you very much." We visited briefly, said our goodbyes, and a week later, after being lost for nearly 20 years, the Bible was returned and rests on the nightstand beside my bed. Sadly, Steve's dad, who had enjoyed perfect health his entire life, was diagnosed with cancer and died within months. How is one faithful with a story like this? You tell it. So I began telling the story to people, and their responses were often similar. "I'm getting goosebumps," or "That's unbelievable." Brittany also became accustomed to me telling the story as well, and she integrated the pieces that made concrete sense. That is, she had a brother named Patrick who was in heaven, and she would see him someday. I began to recognize the guilt and the shame that I had buried and carried over the years for having abandoned my son at the time of his death. I reconciled some of this by traveling to Patrick's public grave at the university and by visiting my father's grave, where the prayer my father gave at Patrick's memorial service had been adapted for Dad's grave marker. It read, "Give us courage where we are weak, grace and knowledge to remember our blessings. We thank you, O Lord, for our Dad, for the faith, hope, and love of life he instilled in each one of us." As I completed my visit and walked away from Dad's grave, a quiet voice spoke clearly to my spirit. "Write a song about Patrick in the Bible." I tucked it away amidst the business of the week and spoke of it to no one. 8 weeks have now passed. We had a small birthday party for a friend. The air is saturated with a misting rain, and we take cover in the gazebo where the cake is served and music is played. As I strum a song, Brittany interrupts. "Dad, tell the story about Patrick's little white Bible." I continue to strum on my guitar and work on offering words that will enhance the celebration. Brittany heckles me again. "Dad, you need to write a song about Patrick and the little white Bible." She stabs a fist over her head and looks away, void of social cues or nuances, but intuitively bull's-eyeing the message I had received at Dad's grave.